Hi, and thanks for joining me on this episode of Tethr's Customer Experience Podcast. I'm Robert Beasley, CEO of Tethr, and today I'm going to be continuing my conversation with Matt Dixon and Ted McKenna. If you didn't listen to the last two episodes, you should start there. Today, we're going to talk about how to overcome customer indecision using the methods that Matt and Ted outlined in their new book, The JOLT Effect. So good to see you guys again.
Great to see you, Robert. Thanks for having us back.
Here again. You bet. So why don't we just jump right in and first kind of start with those high performer salespeople that are already out there, and many of them, I think you came across that they were actually already doing the right kinds of behaviors when they were running into indecision. How did you notice that, and what were some of the things that you noticed that high performers were doing?
Yeah, maybe I'll give a high level walk through some of the behaviors, and then Ted, you can go back and sort of double click on some of these, or we can explore any of these. And I think the important thing here is that, these things, again, a lot of what we found was counter to what I think salespeople have been taught for many years. And what we're able to do with Tethr and the power of conversation intelligence is really kind of delve pretty deeply into what were these salespeople saying and how were they behaving, what were they doing that was different from what most sellers were doing. I mean, I think at the highest level, what we found is that, there's a big difference between, we all know this, between star salespeople and average salespeople. In our study, we found the average win rate was about 26%. High performers are converting closer to, they're in the high 50s, close to 60% conversion rate. But the biggest swing variable, Robert, between those two maybe is I would say how high performers deal with those cold feet moments that we know all customers have when they're being sold to. And oftentimes those cold feet moments happen after the customer says, yeah, I want to, I'm convinced of the value. Let's move forward. Let's talk about doing business together. And that's where things start to fall apart for the salesperson. The customer, what seems like a sure thing suddenly becomes not so sure of a thing. And the customer starts talking themselves out of it. And they start backpedaling and waffling and wavering and hemming and hawing and wringing their hands and all the things we think of about those customers who become indecisive about how to move forward. And high performers have figured out there's a different kind of playbook you need to run. And I think I may have mentioned this in the last time we were together, but the difference between the two playbooks, all salespeople know how to dial up the FOMO, right? The fear of missing out, help the customer realize what they stand to lose if they don't buy your product, they don't buy your service, they don't buy your solution, how awful things are going to be, or maybe they dangle that, expiring discount or special offer or what have you to just get the person to say yes now. But what it actually turns out is that customers are actually less concerned about FOMO. What they're more concerned about is FOMO. It's not the fear of missing out; it's the fear of messing up, and it's their concern about making a big mistake, right? So we've got to dial up the fear of not purchasing. That's important to deal with it. Instill that FOMO and get the customer to move forward and state their intent. But if we wanted to actually sign the dotted line, we got to deal with that fear of messing up. And that's about actually not dialing up the fear of not purchasing, but dialing down the fear of purchasing. How do we make the customer feel like I'm making a great decision here? I'm in good hands. I don't feel like I'm going to be left holding the bag or I'm going to look like a fool for making this purchase. I think I'm going to look like a hero. And that came down to, in our research, 4 specific behaviors. JOLT is actually an acronym. The 4 behaviors are: judge the level of indecision, offer your recommendation, limit the exploration, and then take risk off the table. I'll just give a real high level here, and then Ted will kind of pull you in. But judge the level of indecision. This is really about using active listening and trying to get the customer to surface those fears. What are their fears of messing up? How do we get those things on the table so we could have a conversation about them and deal with them? And, look, we all know high performers don't chase garbage trucks. And what we found in our research through a lot of interviews we did with high performing salespeople is they evaluate an opportunity, not just on that company or that individual's ability to buy, do they have budget? Is a good use case fit in alignment with our value proposition? All the stuff we all know we should evaluate an opportunity on, but also on their ability to decide. Are they personally indecisive? Are there sources of indecision? Are there contextual factors like budget scrutiny, like time pressure, maybe the fact that they bought a similar solution in the past and it didn't work out, and now there's extra scrutiny on this decision right now. All these things can kind of amplify indecision. So as a salesperson, we got to diagnose it, because that tells us how do we overcome it? It guides us to what the playbook should look like. And then it also tells us how we should forecast that opportunity. And it tells us whether maybe we should disqualify it. If this person or this company is hopelessly indecisive, maybe our time's better spent elsewhere. Offering your recommendation, this is all about, look, in sales, I think we love giving our customers lots of options, and it feels good. And it's actually very attractive when we think about marketing above the funnel. When we think about those early demos and those conversations we have, like, we want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. We want to, paint the art of the possible, right? But very quickly, the customer starts to look at all these options and they think they all look good, and then they don't know what to pick. And so we got to help them pick something. And that's all about offering a recommendation. And there were two specific behaviors we found that Tethr was really instrumental in pinpointing and then quantifying the impact of these. One is proactive guidance. How do we actually guide our customer from the 100 options down to the small, choice set, the 2 or 3 options that would be a good fit? And then advocacy. How do we then put our personal seal of approval? I think, Robert, you should go with this configuration because customers like you love this configuration and they're super happy with it. So those things really help overcome those valuation problems we talked about last time, that the customers fear that I might pick the wrong thing. Limiting the exploration. How do we get our customer to stop spinning their wheels, doing their own research? How do we get them to trust us? They don't need to know as much as we do. We need to do a little bit of research to be smart enough, but then we need them to make a decision. In our research, we found that there's lots of ways that salespeople do this. One is that they really work hard to position themselves as an expert. They do a lot. They talk as confidently as they can about the product, often doing their own demos. They don't bring a clown car of experts to every single sales call. They try to lean on their own expertise and develop their own expertise. And when they have to bring in other people, they do it in an orchestrated way. So what I'm not going to do is say, hey, I brought Robert. Robert's our head of engineering. Robert, take it away. Because you know why? Robert hates that because he's not the salesperson. He's the head of engineering. And then also, it sends a message to your customer that you're not an expert. And if the customer feels like they're not being sold to by an expert, then they are going to do their own research. They're not going to feel like it's like booking a trip to a country you've never been to before with a travel agent who's never been there either, or doesn't know anything about it, right? Never booked it. And so you want to, and if you're in that situation, it's like, well, I'm going to do a lot of my own research because you don't know any more than I do. So we got to instill that confidence, and we got to help the customer avoid spinning their wheels. And then the last one, taking risk off the table. This is all about de-risking, dealing with that outcome uncertainty, giving the customer the confidence so they won't be left holding the bag. This will not go sideways. You're going to look like a hero, not like a fool. And there's so many things that we use Tethr to identify that are super effective. One is managing proper expectations with the customer is hugely impactful. Not overselling the customer on what your solution is going to do, but setting proper expectations about what it's going to do, and then everything else is upside, right? Predicating the business case and the decision around that. Bringing in your customer success team early, showing them the roadmap of how we're going to roll this out, explaining what could go wrong and how we're going to deal with those things if they do go wrong. And then also, in providing options to manage downside risk, whether that's a prorated refund or whether it's some other creative option that we can use to help the customer feel like, there's a safety net here for me. So, and what you see in the book, which is, I think, really interesting, and one of the real powers of using conversational data, is tons of examples of salespeople saying and doing these things. Like, here's what it sounds like, not just a theory, but actually, this is what it sounds like in a sales call.
Yeah, I just find myself, Matt, wishing that FOMO rolled off the tongue quite as well as FOMO.
I know.
We're so close to something great. I mean, the only thing I'd add there is you think about the type of research that Matt and I typically do, and of course did for this study, is we call it sort of studying lead steers. And so what that means is we didn't make this up from whole cloth. We went and observed what people are actually doing right now. So there are people listening to this podcast today. There are people in your sales force who do these things, right? And so you can use technology like Tethr to go and observe what at what rate at which your high performers are doing these things differently than their average performing peers. And you're going to see differences. Now, different organizations will spike in different ways. Some organizations will be particularly strong on recommendations. Other organizations will be particularly strong on limiting the exploration and so forth. But I think it's nice to be able to see what those outliers might be and manage towards those. So when you see somebody who's, doing something at a 10% rate, when most everyone else is doing this at least half of the time, and your high performers are doing it 75% of the time, that tells you quite a bit that they address these situations quite differently. And so it became really powerful for us, even after we finished the predictive models, then go back to a whole bunch of calls and say, wow, what's going on? Why is there so much variation here amongst the team on some of these behaviors? And it starts to tell you a lot about what actually makes a difference versus what types of things are sort of will happen, but it's kind of noise. They're going to happen a lot, but they don't really matter versus the things that either don't happen very often and matter quite a bit, or they do happen with some regularity but matter a lot. Expectation setting is a good example. Like one of the most powerful behaviors in the entire model. And for some high performers, they do it with some regularity, but it becomes a very, very important element of how they set expectations, how they push past indecision for those buyers who are kind of stuck.
The last thing I'll add here to what Ted's saying is, if you think about, here's something that's really different in a world of conversation intelligence, I think, Robert, is that, if I think about anything, Ted and I we're part of the team that put together the Challenger research years ago. And I think this is not just true of Challenger, but it's true of almost any sales approach that you would, as a sales leader, you would roll out. Whatever your methodology is, whatever your process is, whatever your engagement approach is, you roll it out. And how do we know whether it worked? How do we know whether people are doing the things they were taught in sales training? Well, typically what we do is we hand out the smile sheets at the end of the training. We ask people if they liked it or not. And that's kind of all we have to go on. And then you look back and you're like, well, the numbers went up or they went down. Does that mean the training worked? Well, maybe, but there's a lot of other stuff we did too. Like a competitor went out of business. We changed the price of our product. We launched some new capabilities, all these. So you never really know if it was that. What's so powerful about conversation intelligence is like the age of wondering, A, whether anybody's doing what they've been trained and coached to do, and B, whether it's actually working or not. Like there's no more guessing. Like you can actually know with certainty who's doing what with what frequency, as Ted's talking about, and then also what impact it's having on win rates. And that's not true just of sales training and approaches like the JOLT approach. It's also true of rolling out new offers, new products and new brand messages, new sales pitches and sales messaging, so we can really understand how our customers respond to these things and whether they're having the desired effect.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. I always say that a platform like Tethr is kind of the holy grail for sales performance improvement, because you can actually see what are they doing and is it working or is it not working. And so
exactly,
could never do that in the past.
No, it was you're throwing darts at a dartboard and guessing. So
yeah, totally. Ted, so for people that are listening that may not know conversation intelligence or conversation analytics platforms up close and personal, describe a little bit about how Tethr organizes these things that we call categories, but basically models for different things that could occur in a conversation. How it's organized and how you took all of those with the team, all of those, and put them together to get the insights that ultimately led to the JOLT effect.
Yeah. So using technology like Tethr, you're going to be able to measure both sides of the conversation. You're going to measure the frequency of which salespeople are executing certain types of behaviors, skills, objection, or rebuttals, I should say, to objections and so forth. So lots of different things that the seller will use as a way to position their product, sell it in lots of different ways, and then look to close that piece of business. But you're also going to be able to understand how the buyer's feeling about that situation, the sentiment that they're expressing, and the way in which they're reacting to those offers, to include potential rebuttals. I'm sorry, now I did it again in reverse. Objections that they're giving to those potential offers. And so these are all representations inside of Tethr's ML. So these are individual behaviors represented by hundreds, sometimes thousands of unique phrases and utterances and contextual identifiers of this is how a seller might go about offering proactive guidance, or this is a version of how somebody might set expectations, or this is a different way in which a customer might express uncertainty. And so one of the real benefits of using a platform like Tethr is that they've already done the hard work to codify a lot of that in code. So it's sitting there just waiting to be used so you can understand how often these things are happening. But of course, using conversation intelligence, you also get a chance to use conversation measures themselves, audio measures, for instance, when you're looking at individual interactions. So you can see things like, does it matter what percentage of the conversation each party is talking. At what rate are they over talking or interrupting each other? These things do end up having slight impact in terms of the way in which the course of the conversation ensues, and in some ways is sort of an indicator of the emotion, right? And the engagement level and kind of what's going on in terms of the active nature of that conversation. So these are all variables that we, Matt and I, as researchers, looked at and said, hey, let's run a predictive model using these measures that we think are really important for us to understand about sales performance. There might be other things that might be company specific or sort of conditionally specific things that are market specific or competitively specific for other industries that we can't generalize across lots of organizations. So we're going to put those aside and study more of the things that generalize that most organizations are going to care about. And then we collected sales performance data to understand and even observe in some cases the rate at which they were closing that sale within that conversation, right? And so that all allowed us to run that predictive model and say those variables, those categories inside Tethr serve as variables in our model that we run a regression against those outcomes, which is sales performance or sales outcomes, depending on the circumstance. And that all tells us not just at what rate are these things happening, which you can see every day inside Tethr, but how much do they matter in terms of performance? Are they really driving upward levels of performance for individual people? So that's the short version of what we were able to.
I like, and it's funny because I think Ted reminded me, so we have a lot of people probably listening to the show who are sales leaders, right? I have a lot of other folks who are, service leaders or support leaders or customer success leaders, other roles. And I think one of the really interesting things is to learn about what's the outcome you're trying to drive as a leader. So just for example, let's imagine we have customer support leaders on here, and maybe they're trying to drive a high CSAT number or low customer effort score or a high NPS, or maybe they're trying to drive fewer escalations and callbacks and things like that, or fewer transfers. Those are specific outcomes. And I think what Tethr makes it possible to do is take all this mess of the conversation, like the audio, the back and forth between the rep and the customer, and kind of break it down and say, what are the things that actually drove that outcome we care about? And why that's really powerful is, as a leader or manager, that now it tells you, well, what do you want to measure people on? What do you want to do your quality assurance around? What do you want to drive through your training and your coaching and in the messages that leaders send about what's important and what's not? And again, Robert, this, we've worked with a lot of companies over the years in customer support, for instance, about quality assurance. And, you look at these scorecards and it's like, they're clearly made up by a bunch of people sitting in a conference room, not using technology like Tethr to really bring math and science to it. Because boy, if you knew what drove those outcomes you care about, then people are being directed to do the right things, do fewer of the wrong things. People feel like they're going to be more successful in the role because they're operating with science and data and data-backed insight. And then those good outcomes happen. And then you're not just sitting going back in the conference room saying, we adjusted our QA scorecard, but clearly we didn't do it right. So what else should be on it? Because we're not getting the outcomes we want. So you get out of the guessing game.
There's a dirty little secret actually when you start to analyze conversation data, and not a lot of vendors are very honest about this, is that co-occurrence is a really difficult problem to weed through. What that means is, to Matt's point earlier, lots of things happen at the exact same time. So just going to measure that this thing is happening is interesting sometimes, but it's not always indicative of what actually makes a difference in terms of that person's performance. So the value of having research like this to point our eyes towards the things that do matter and say, okay, out of all the things that could matter, these are the things that really do. So let's pay attention now to this smaller set of things that we know will happen. Now, other stuff's going to happen too. And we, of course, want to understand, outliers on those things at a certain level as well. But let's pay a particular attention to these specific things because we know these are the ones that drive overperformance.
Yeah, I've always found it fascinating with the research that you guys have done, both for the JOLT effect and other research that you've done using Tethr, how it's you're not just looking at, did this event occur in a call, but like conditions and sequential things. So did this happen and then later something else happen, and understanding the relationships between multiple events or insights, if you will. So you've got this objection, what were all the rebuttals that were used, and being able to see, okay, out of the 7 different rebuttals, this is the one that's the most effective.
All right,
And
Robert got
even
it right. He got the objections, rebuttals, and
yeah, exactly. I got to hear you twice, so help me out. And then also looking at when did certain things occur in a call, and that affects whether it was good or bad, or how good or bad something was. So that's really a deep level of analysis that you guys have done to produce these types of insights to help salespeople and service people for that matter. So last question.
Sure.
For a sales organization that wants to get started on, identifying, recognizing indecision and starting to deal with it, obviously reading the book would be a good first start, but what other things would you recommend for them wanting to get started?
Yeah, there's a number of things. So I think one is there's a lot of, oftentimes we have, and we've done a lot of this lately, Robert knows this, but we have a lot of companies who hear about it. Maybe they read an advanced version of the book. We had an article in HBR a couple months ago, shared some of those insights, and they kind of think, we're recording our sales calls. Like, I wonder how often this is happening, and are people doing the right things, the wrong things? Like, how do we compare? And so that's actually analysis we can do using Tethr. So companies, you got recorded sales calls. As a research organization, we can work with you and using Tethr to do all of that assessment, tell you how much indecision is happening on your calls, what are the behaviors happening in what quantities, how do your best people compare to your average people, how do you compare to world class, what we're seeing in the overall data set. So that's, oftentimes these firms just have this data sitting there. And so if you want to get a sense of how big is indecision and as a problem in sales, and how close are people to doing the right stuff and less of the wrong stuff, like the answer's there. We can help you find it using Tethr. And then, of course, come visit us at jolteffect.com. We've got plenty of other resources and services we can bring to bear to help you then kind of get your people doing, again, more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff from a development, training, coaching perspective as well.
The only other thing I'd add to that is that there's a chapter in the book where we talk a little bit more in depth, a lot more in depth actually, about how this might differ by different sales settings. So Matt mentioned a whole bunch of examples of things like how the best sellers limit the expiration or how they go about taking risks off the table. Some of that, of course, is going to differ if you are selling in an inbound situation where you're looking to close a sale in the next 30 minutes. You're not bringing on a call partner, right? You might be able to call in your manager to parachute in and help you. And so we lay out a lot of those differences about sort of what does this look like in different sales contexts. Importantly, the behaviors still ring true across all settings, but how it presents itself, the examples, of course, will differ a little bit, and we go into depth on that in the book.
Yeah, and I think the reason they don't vary very much, and if you look at very transactional sales that we studied in very complex sales, and the winning behaviors are kind of the same, and how they're applied to Ted's point varies a little bit because the context and the situation varies. But the reason they're the same, I think, is because indecision is a human problem, and all of our customers are human beings, and they struggle with this fear of messing up, and that's ultimately what the story is all about. And so whether you're selling, cell phone accessories or like simple B2B transactional purchases in, as Ted's saying, short inbound calls, short cycle time, or you're selling like a complex solution that takes 6 to 12 months to close and it's $1 million deal, you're still dealing with this fear of messing up. And the solution set, the JOLT effect, is applicable, again, in different ways, but equally applicable and relevant across all of those contexts.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, Ted, thanks again for your time. It's been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it. For our listeners, if you missed the previous 2 episodes, go back and check those out. You can also go to tethr.com/jolt to learn more, and absolutely subscribe to our podcast, and head out to amazon.com, get your copy of the new JOLT Effect book. And we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Robert.
Well, thanks, Robert.
Thanks.
Take care.